Hi everyone, this is Crash Me Twice, and today I would like to share the second part of my SimPit Office Pilot Chair mod. The block with the input connections, which you have seen me finishing in the last video, is now installed into the chair's receiving tube. 10 gauge audio cables are routed from the inside of the receiver tube outwards. To make this easier, I have soldered a higher gauge single cable to the audio cable. This helps me pull the thicker audio cables through the holes, which I have drilled into the chair seat plate. The block with the input connections, which you have seen me finishing in the last video, is now installed into the chair's receiving tube. I'm using a coarse bolt to aid with the installation. This bolt gives me something to get a hold on. Next, I am test fitting the block with the output connections to make sure it's seating completely and makes contact with the receiver block. I'm now screwing the receiver block down into the tube. And this is how it looks installed. Here you can also see clearly the vertical weld which I have made the key slots in the blocks for. I'm using my multimeter to confirm that all connections are working. All works as it should. I have purchased a bass shaker, also known as a transducer. The green PCB-based subwoofer amplifier you see here was replaced with a fuzzy amp later. The 4 self-threading bolts and washers are for mounting the shaker to the chair. A good amount of audio cable for routing all of it to my DAC. This audio cable is 10 gauge OFC, which stands for oxygen-free copper. This is pure copper cable and not clad with copper coating, which is far inferior to this cable. Okay, I'm finishing up the cable routing and using a few plastic cable clamps to hold it in place. I have drilled the mounting holes of the shaker a bit out. This allows me to use bolts which are a bit thicker in diameter. Installing the shaker is fairly straightforward. Find a good spot where it fits and pre-drill each of the mounting holes. I'm using a 3/32 drill bit for that, and after I screw the bolts in and verify everything fits, I take them back out and apply some wood glue onto the sets. Works like Loctite but for wood. In the next step, I am tinning the ends of the audio cable to prevent fraying of the fine stranded wire. Color shrink tubing identifies easily what's the positive and the negative lead. The shaker has spring-loaded connectors to hold the cable in place. I clip off the excess on the leads and place the last plastic clamps onto the chair. A washer and self-threading Phillips screws do the fine job at this. Cabling and shaker done. Okay, back to the block which connects to the one in the receiver tube. I need to make spring-loaded connections to allow a bit of play in the event the block is not 100% seated flat. Some wiggle room. Each of these sleeves will receive a connection rod made from copper round rod, which will then slide up and down inside of them. I have in the lathe the acetal rod which needs to be faced and drilled. The inside of this part needs to be recessed to work as a stop for the copper connector. The finished acetal sleeves are now press fit into the block. I'm using my machining vise for this job. Next is to machine the copper connectors. I'm turning them down to a size which will fit inside the sleeves. They need to be 1 or 2 thousandths under, as I don't want them to bind. In addition, I will use some dialystic grease in the final assembly to make sure they don't. I verify a good fit and everything seems to work as I hoped it would. The copper connectors now need to be turned down to the inside diameter of the springs I will be using. The springs came from an old CPU heatsink I no longer have use for, so they're of a good strength and happen to be the perfect size. Now they get drilled to accept the audio cable lead, which will be soldered into it. I'm now going to solder the lead into the copper connector I just made. The oxygen-free copper wire I'm using has thicker strands, a bit less insulation thickness, and can be routed therefore easier within 4080 aluminum profile this assembly will mount to. Because the copper connector is so thick, I would have trouble using my electronic solder station to get enough heat into it for the solder to melt, so I'm using a plumbing torch. A scrap piece of aluminum makes a nice heatsink so that I don't burn my fingers when removing and filing down any excess solder from spots it shouldn't be. Remember, I was marking this profile in the previous video. Now I will be milling out the marked sections to create slots for the cabling. The cables can be routed through the slots and will run inside the middle channel of the aluminum profile. The now spring outfitted connectors are inserted into the sleeves of the block. The orientation is important, or I end up with reverse polarity. Never a good thing. To prevent this from happening, I have marked on the block which sleeve is positive and which one is negative. I also have made two small half-inch cable sleeves which act as a spring stopper and isolating barrier between the spring-loaded connector and the profile. I don't want anything shortening to ground. So, first the connector with the cable, then the spring, and at last the sleeve. All is now pushed into the sleeve in the block. Cable routing is next. As I have already mentioned, the cable will run in the middle channel of the profile. The connection block is then mounted to the profile with 4 T-slot nuts. If you look closely, you can see the positive and negative polarity markings I have stamped into the top of the block. I have also milled a small slot into the profile for the cable to exit. I soldered the cable leads to prevent fraying and use a brass connector, which I have made long time ago for a different project. Practically a brass rod with a through hole and on each end a couple of M3 threads for set screws to hold the cable in place. I am connecting the cable from the block to the audio cable with that connector and use shrink tubing to finish this job. One T10 hosing spacer is used to keep them spaced, and there's an easy mounting solution. I am now making a plate for holding the crossover. A scrap piece of HDPE, which is a plastic, a bit of marking and milling. It was a quick way of getting this done. I want this to look good and create a recessed section in the plate to mount the PCB to. The mounting holes for the PCB are drilled and threaded. For the bass shaker, I purchased a 100 watt bass woofer amp, as you can see here. I'm using automotive double-sided adhesive tape to mount the plate with the crossover to my bass woofer amp. As the cable would be too thick to mount to the connection blocks on the crossover PCB, I split each lead into a fork shape and tinned it. To be able to have my cables point upwards without bending the cable itself, I modify a banana connector to an angle connector for both poles. One quick fitting test and I'm finally to the last step of the project. I am mounting the aluminum profile to the seat post I've created in the last video and using the T-slot nuts to hold it in place. Fits like a glove, well, if you don't look at the hammering portion. Here's the final conclusion. The seat is lowered onto the block, bridging the connections to the base shaker, and at the same time, because the block is square, it anchors the chair in place and preventing any movement whatsoever. No more sliding back and forward, doesn't rotate, and keeps always the set and correct distance to the rudder panels. A bit more routing of cables from the post to the DAC and to the bass amp, and this project is completed. Because you can't feel what I'm feeling, I quickly loaded up DCS and I made this bass shaker presentation just for you. With the pallet chair left armrest up, my hand on the collective, the other on the cyclic, I think to myself, what a wonderful takeoff. So don't forget to check out my Discord channel and to visit my website for project downloads. I'm planning more projects in the future, so please keep an eye out for my next video. Hope you all enjoyed this build, and I hope I earned a like from you. Crash Me Twice, out.